By 1942, one fact was beyond dispute inside German high command. America was not a serious military threat. The argument was simple, and the men making it were not fools. They had studied American military history. They had watched the United States stumble through its own depression, slash its military budgets to almost nothing, and field an army in 1939 that ranked 19th in the world, smaller than Portugal's. They had seen American soldiers train with wooden rifles because there weren't enough real ones to go around. They had read the reports of American industry, powerful on paper but untested, unproven, and in their professional judgment, incapable of converting civilian production into genuine military output at the speed a modern war demanded. More than that, they had seen what happened to France, a nation with a real army, real tanks, real experience, in 6 weeks in 1940. If France couldn't stop Germany, what exactly was America going to do about it? German generals in 1942 were not operating on blind arrogance. They were operating on evidence. And the evidence, as they read it, said America was a country of factories and movies and jazz music, not a country capable of breaking the Wehrmacht. What they didn't know was that British intelligence had already begun listening to them, not in interrogation rooms, not through informants, in their bedrooms, at their dinner tables, in the garden, on benches they never suspected were wired. And what those microphones were capturing, one conversation at a time, was the slow, private collapse of everything German high command was saying in public. General Wilhelm von Thoma is 51 years old when British forces capture him on November 4, 1942, in the desert outside El Alamein. He is not a minor figure. He commanded the Afrika Korps itself in the final days of the North African campaign, stepping in when Rommel was absent on medical leave. He fought in the Spanish Civil War, in Poland, in France, on the Eastern Front. He is, by any measure, one of Germany's most experienced and most trusted battlefield commanders, the kind of officer Hitler dispatches to difficult situations because he expects results. His capture is unusual in its own right. British accounts describe von Thoma walking toward Allied lines alone after his command vehicle was destroyed, declining to hide or flee, surrendering himself personally to Brigadier John Harding. That same evening, the British commander General Bernard Montgomery invites von Thoma to dinner, a gesture that becomes one of the war's stranger footnotes. Two senior officers dining together while their armies are still fighting in the same desert. Within days, von Thoma is on his way to England. His destination is Trent Park, a large country manor in North London in the suburb of Cockfosters, that British intelligence has quietly transformed into the most sophisticated prisoner surveillance operation of the entire war. From the outside, Trent Park looks less like a prison than a country estate. The grounds are extensive. The rooms are furnished. German generals are addressed by their rank, treated according to their status as military officers, and encouraged to relax into something approaching a normal existence. They are given access to German books and newspapers. A visiting tailor comes to press their uniforms. British officers host elaborate lunches and arrange supervised day trips into central London, to Harrods, to the Savoy, to posh restaurants where the generals eat well and are treated with the deference their rank commands. It is all, every single detail of it, deliberate. The entire operation is the creation of Lieutenant Colonel Thomas Kendrick, a British intelligence officer who spent the pre-war years running agents in Vienna for the Secret Intelligence Service. Kendrick understands something most interrogators don't. You learn more from what a man says when he doesn't think anyone is listening than from anything he tells you when he knows he's being asked. So instead of interrogating German generals in bare rooms with bright lights, Kendrick wines them, dines them, makes them comfortable, and then listens to every word they say among themselves. The microphones are everywhere, hidden in fireplaces, concealed in lamp fittings, tucked into plant pots, built into the billiard table, embedded in garden benches, wired into skirting boards, behind elegant wood paneling so deeply embedded that discovering them would require physically dismantling the walls. A team of secret listeners works in shifts in 3 listening rooms in the basement. The M rooms, M standing for mic'd, recording conversations onto acetate discs, transcribing them, logging them, passing them up to intelligence chiefs who are mining every careless word for information the generals would never have voluntarily surrendered. By the time von Thoma arrives in late 1942, the operation has already been running for 3 years. The transcripts are accumulating by the thousands, and the conversations being captured are nothing like what German High Command is saying publicly. When von Thoma settles into Trent Park in the winter of 1942, he carries with him the professional assumptions of a career German officer, assumptions about American capability, about the direction of the war, about Germany's ultimate ability to outlast its enemies. What happens to those assumptions over the next months, recorded without his knowledge and preserved in archives that won't be declassified for 60 years, is one of the most revealing documents of the entire conflict. The first thing the secret listeners notice about German generals in private is how different they sound from German generals in public. In public, in official statements, in letters home that are reviewed and censored before they're sent, in anything said within earshot of an official Allied interrogator, the generals are disciplined, careful, politically correct in the Nazi sense. They speak of ultimate victory. They speak of the Führer's vision. They speak of temporary setbacks and strategic repositioning, and the certainty that Germany's will cannot be broken. Turn the microphone on when they think they're alone, and a different conversation begins almost immediately. The secret listeners record German generals discussing the war with a candor that would have been unthinkable in any official context. They discuss Hitler's military decisions with open contempt. They discuss failed strategies and incompetent commanders. They discuss, with a frankness that stops the listening teams cold, the growing private understanding that Germany has fundamentally miscalculated the war it has started. November 1942. The same weeks that von Thoma is being driven to Trent Park, the Battle of Stalingrad is entering its catastrophic phase. Field Marshal Friedrich Paulus and the German Sixth Army, over 300,000 men, are about to be encircled by Soviet forces in one of the most devastating military reversals in modern history. The men in the bugged rooms at Trent Park don't know the specific details yet, but they know enough. They have been on the Eastern Front. They have seen the scale of Soviet resistance. They have felt what it means to fight a war of attrition against an enemy that absorbs punishment the way the Soviet Union does. And they have started to factor in something else, something that in 1941 and early 1942 they were professionally comfortable dismissing: America. The United States formally entered the war in December 1941. In the months immediately following Pearl Harbor, German military analysis of American capability remains, on the surface, relatively dismissive. American forces are green. American equipment is largely untested in real combat. American commanders have no experience fighting a modern war. The professional judgment of German officers who have spent 3 years fighting across Europe and North Africa is that America's entry into the conflict, while inconvenient, is not in itself decisive. Germany has fought and beaten better armies than anything America currently has to put in the field. What the generals at Trent Park are beginning to see by late 1942 is that this assessment has a flaw, a fundamental, irreversible flaw. America is not just fighting with the army it has. America is building the army it will have, and the rate at which it is doing so is unlike anything the German military-industrial complex can match. The numbers filtering into the private conversations at Trent Park are staggering. American shipyards are launching vessels faster than German U-boats can sink them. American aircraft factories are producing planes at a rate that makes Germany's best production figures look like a cottage industry. American steel output, American rubber production, American fuel reserves, every metric that a professional military officer uses to assess a nation's war-fighting capacity is running in a direction that, in private, the generals at Trent Park can no longer explain away. Von Thoma, in conversation with fellow generals recorded by the M-Room listeners, does not speak the way German officers speak at official briefings. He speaks the way a man speaks when he is trying to work out, quietly and honestly, what has actually happened to the war he thought he understood. The conversations are careful at first, qualified, the kind of professional hedging that trained military minds default to when the conclusion they're approaching is one they don't want to reach. But as the winter of 1942 becomes the spring of 1943, the hedging falls away. Stalingrad falls in February 1943. The German Sixth Army surrenders. More than 90,000 German soldiers are taken prisoner, including 22 or 23 generals alongside Field Marshal Paulus himself. The exact count varying slightly depending on which records you consult, but the scale of the catastrophe beyond dispute, regardless of the precise figure. In the bugged rooms at Trent Park, the news lands differently than it does in German propaganda broadcasts. The generals don't have access to Goebbels. They have access to each other, and to the accumulated weight of everything they know professionally about what Stalingrad means. What it means, in the private assessment of the men in those rooms, is that the war's outcome is no longer genuinely in doubt. Germany can continue fighting. Germany can inflict enormous damage on its enemies and exact a horrific price for every mile of ground it concedes. But the combination of Soviet industrial and manpower resilience on the Eastern Front and American production capacity flooding into the Western theater has created a mathematical problem that German military genius cannot solve. You can hear it in the transcripts. The language shifts. Officers who spent months speaking about strategic repositioning begin speaking about the terms on which a war might eventually end. Officers who dismissed American military capability in 1941 begin discussing, in specific terms, what American logistics and production have done to the fundamental arithmetic of the conflict. One conversation after another, recorded on acetate discs by secret listeners in the Trent Park basement, documents the moment when Germany's most experienced military minds crossed the private threshold from believing the war was winnable to understanding it was not. What makes it remarkable is not just what the generals are saying. It's the gap between what they're saying in those rooms and what German propaganda is still broadcasting to the German people in the spring of 1943. While Goebbels is telling the German nation that Stalingrad was a heroic sacrifice and that ultimate victory remains Germany's destiny, the men who actually commanded Germany's armies are sitting in a bugged English country house, telling each other a completely different story. This is the moment the secret listener's operation becomes something more than an intelligence-gathering exercise. It becomes a document of private truth versus public fiction, one of the most complete records ever captured of what military leadership actually believes versus what military leadership says it believes, the gap is enormous, and it only widens. By the summer of 1943, new generals are arriving at Trent Park following Allied operations in North Africa and Sicily. They bring with them fresh impressions of American military capability, not the theoretical assessments of 1941 and 1942, but the first-hand experience of fighting American forces in the field, watching American logistics operate, observing American equipment and American air power in action. What they describe in the bugged rooms is not the undisciplined, production-heavy, but combat-soft army that German professional opinion predicted. It is an army learning fast, supplied at a rate that staggers officers accustomed to German supply lines stretched to their limits, and backed by an industrial base that is simply operating at a different scale than anything the Axis can field. The conversations about American production specifically are among the most striking in the Trent Park archive. German generals who have spent their careers in a military culture that prized tactical brilliance and operational flexibility over raw industrial output are grappling in private with the realization that in this particular war, at this particular scale, raw industrial output is winning. The Sherman tank is not as good as the Panther or the Tiger. American generals are not, in 1943, as tactically sophisticated as their German counterparts. But America is building Shermans at a rate that absorbs every loss and keeps the pressure constant, while Germany's capacity to replace Panthers and Tigers and the crews trained to fight them is shrinking with every passing month. You don't win a war of attrition, the generals at Trent Park are privately concluding, by being better. You win it by having more. And America, combined with the Soviet Union on the other side, has more. More of everything. More than Germany can possibly match, regardless of how well individual German formations fight. This is what the microphones captured. Not treason, not cowardice, just honesty. The kind of honest professional assessment that the men in those rooms were actively forbidden from expressing anywhere outside those walls. Meanwhile, back in Germany, the public message never wavers. Goebbels broadcasts, Hitler speaks. German newspapers print accounts of strategic withdrawals that are victories by another name. The German people, in the summer of 1943, are still being told the war is going according to plan. In a bugged country house in North London, Germany's captured generals are not saying anything of the sort. If this story is still in your head right now, if you're still thinking about what it means that the men commanding Germany's armies knew the truth this early and couldn't say it, that like button is the right response. Hit it. The intelligence value of the Trent Park operation extends far beyond the private admissions of defeated generals. The secret listeners captured operational intelligence, details of German weapons programs, assessments of German weaknesses on specific fronts, information about command structures and strategic priorities that fed directly into Allied planning throughout the war. One conversation, captured at Trent Park, revealed details of the German experimental weapons program at Peenemünde. That intelligence directly contributed to the planning of Operation Crossbow, the August 1943 RAF bombing raid that devastated Peenemünde and significantly set back Germany's rocket weapons development. Other transcripts captured assessments of German anti-tank capabilities, details of U-boat operations, evaluations of Allied bombing effectiveness from the perspective of the men on the receiving end, information that no direct interrogation would have produced because the generals would never have volunteered it knowingly. But the deeper significance of Trent Park is what it reveals about the structure of the war itself. The 100,000 pages of transcripts, classified for 60 years, sitting in the National Archives in London and Washington, D.C. until the mid-1990s, and not properly analyzed by historians until Sönke Neitzel's research in the early 2000s. Documents something that no official German wartime record admits and no post-war memoir quite captures. The moment when Germany's own military leadership privately concluded that the war was lost, while publicly continuing to prosecute it. That gap between private knowledge and public position has enormous implications for how we understand the war's final 2 years. Germany fought on until May 1945, nearly 2 full years after the private conversations at Trent Park suggest its senior commanders had concluded the outcome was inevitable. Hundreds of thousands of additional deaths on all sides in a war that the men commanding it privately believed was already decided. For America specifically, the Trent Park transcripts are a kind of validation arriving 60 years late. The German generals sitting in those bugged rooms were not crediting American propaganda or Allied press releases when they revised their assessments of American military capability. They were crediting what they had personally observed: American logistics, American production, American air power, American soldiers learning and adapting faster than German professional condescension had predicted. The private respect that German military leadership developed for American capability, captured without any possibility of diplomatic calculation, is perhaps the most honest assessment of American wartime performance that exists. Wilhelm von Thoma remains at Trent Park until late 1946, when he is repatriated to Germany shortly after his leg is amputated while still in captivity. 5 years as a prisoner in the English country house where his private conversations were recorded without his knowledge. He dies in 1948 in his hometown of Dachau, Bavaria, at the age of 56. The transcripts of his conversations and those of the 58 other German generals held at Trent Park remain classified in British and American archives for decades. It is not until 2001 that historian Sönke Neitzel, researching German U-boat warfare in the British National Archives, stumbles across the first tranche of transcripts almost by accident. What he finds sends him back repeatedly over the following years, eventually producing 2 landmark works of historical analysis built on nearly 800 pages of primary source transcripts that the generals who spoke those words never imagined anyone would ever read. The Trent Park house itself still stands in North London. In recent years, it has been converted into a museum, one of the few places in the world where visitors can stand in the rooms where captured German generals sat talking freely and understand, looking at the hidden wiring still embedded in the walls, exactly how completely they were being listened to the entire time. Thomas Kendrick, the British intelligence officer who designed and ran the operation, kept its existence secret for the rest of his life. He never publicly acknowledged what had been done at Trent Park. He died in 1972, the transcript still classified, the operation still unknown, outside a small circle of wartime intelligence veterans. It would be another 23 years before the files were declassified, and another 6 before a historian thought to look at them properly. History is full of things that were known privately and said publicly only decades later. What makes Trent Park different is that the private knowledge was captured in real time, on acetate discs, by listeners who wrote it all down in transcripts that survived the war intact. The generals talked, the listeners recorded, the archives held everything until the world was ready to hear it. We carry these stories carefully, every fact verified, every name checked, every detail earned. If that standard matters to you, subscribe and help us maintain it. Where are you watching from? Drop your country below. Better yet, what forgotten story from your nation deserves this treatment? We might cover it. We read every suggestion. Thank you for carrying the weight of Wilhelm von Thoma's story forward and the story of every man who spoke honestly in those bugged rooms, not knowing a word of it would survive them. They told the truth when the truth was forbidden. The least we can do is listen.